Indigenous. Bonjour, comment ça va? Hi, how are you? So I'm really happy to be with you. Je suis très content d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. Bienvenue à la deuxième session pour la mobilisation des connaissances. So welcome to the second session for knowledge mobilization. So I'm really happy to be with you guys. So we as I speak, a Newick table, the National Urban Indigenous Coalition Council. I represent Quebec. I'm on the Wendat Nation territory, so the Nia-Wentio in Quebec Wendake. So again, I'm really pleased to be with you. I won't say a prayer because I'm not recognized as like someone really spiritual by my community, but like we did last time, I suggest that we all take 1 minute to do our own prayer. Donc, je vais suggérer que chacun d'entre nous prenne 1 minute et fasse sa propre prière dans la langue qu'il veut. So, like, let's do it now, and we're going to start the show after, okay? If you want to smudge, si vous voulez smudger, go ahead. You're free to do it. Just to be in a good spirit, juste pour être dans un bon état d'esprit. And well, one last thing. So, une dernière chose, governance is really, really important as an organization, especially a new one like Newick. So for us, it was really, really good to do a governance session for all our coalition or groups that are in today. Donc, c'était vraiment pertinent pour nous de faire une session sur la gouvernance, en fait deux, puisque toutes les nouvelles organisations, comme la Table nationale des coalitions, ont besoin de se structurer au niveau de la gouvernance. So today we have Chantel that's going to be there to do the presentation with VOR, our communication partner. So if you have any technical problems, like you can, I don't know how it works, but just raise your hand and we're going to help you for sure. Donc, si vous avez un problème technique, juste levez votre main, on va vous aider pour sûr. So on that, I'm going to leave like the Zoom to Chantel. Am I right? Good. Go ahead. It's yours.
Lovely. Thank you, Jean-François. Merci. So good day, everybody. Just as a couple logistical things before I get into the whole part of the day. If you do have any technical issues, you can just message Erwin in the chat at the Newick Tech ID with any questions that you might have. In terms of translation, as Christina had said, when folks were coming in, on the bottom bar of your Zoom, there's an ability to select for French or English translation. And thank you very much to our translators who are doing all of that work today. So that way it's accessible for anybody in whatever language you might best intake this information that's being shared. Also, do feel free as we go to chat in the chat. I personally really love when we're able to, like share ideas throughout in the chat. If you have particular questions for Nicholas and Scott, who are going to be our main presenters today, you can drop them in the chat and then we can come back to them later. I'll make sure to copy them so that they don't get lost. And just to give you an idea of how this is going to flow today, it's going to be really similar to last time. For those of you who didn't join us last time, what that's going to look like is Nicholas and Scott are going to present for an amount of time. We might have time before the top of the hour to have a short Q&A, but at the top of the hour, wherever it is that you are, we'll take a 5-minute break for the translators and then come back, and then we'll have some conversational dialogue time until the end of the second hour. So that's what that is going to look like. But I guess with that, I will just jump into it. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Welcome to our second event in the 2021-2022 NUIC Knowledge Mobilization Hub Speaker Series, quite a mouthful. Stories have always been our governance. We hope you continue joining us on the last Friday of every month in 2022 to continue learning and sharing. By being present with each other in this way, we get to share our practices, successes, and challenges, and foster skills that lead to positive and meaningful benefits for urban Indigenous communities. So we are also organizing a research caucus within NUIC for 2022 that we would love for you to be involved in. The caucus will meet once per month and be a space made specifically for the kinds of things that we'll be doing in the second hour, sharing questions, strategies, challenges, and successes in all of the research activities that you might have. This might look like talking through issues of knowledge mobilization on reports or work you have already done, getting support on a project you're currently working on, or sharing strategies to continue to make urban Indigenous research better all the time. And just a quick note that the lens that I personally take, and I think that a lot of us here in this space take, is of research is incredibly expansive, that many things that we do are research. So this can include programming or service provision or art projects or whatever it is that you're doing. I think that when we gather together, it's always a good time to learn and grow together. So these meetings will also be important for continuing to directly guide the work and direction of the Indigenous Knowledge Mobilization Hub events and resources that we offer. So we hope that you and your staff join us in this new NUIC space that we're continuing to build. And you can email me if you want to get involved or want to pass it along to your staff. So I'll just drop my email in the chat. But today, we are very grateful to be joined by two of the authors from Research 101, a manifesto for ethical research in the Downtown East Side. Scott and Nicholas are among the many people who are working across the country to improve the ethics, accountability, and experience in research for urban peoples, especially urban Indigenous peoples, who we know are wildly over-researched, which is something that I'm sure that we'll be talking about a lot. So we're really delighted that they can join us today to talk more about that work. So yeah, with that, I am going to turn it over to Nicholas and Scott to introduce themselves. So take it away, you two. Thank you so much for being here.
And thank you so much for inviting us. We are going to do a very brief intro here, and then Nick's going to share some of the stuff he's been thinking about and some of his reflections and experiences around Indigenous research specifically. And then I'll talk a little bit more about some of the work we've done with Research 101. And then we'll hopefully still have a bit of time for questions. But yeah, we'll just start off. And thanks, Chantal, for acknowledging, of course, long, painful histories of colonial colonization and research really being used as a tool of extraction and exploitation and control and harm in Indigenous communities. And so while our work with Research 101 wasn't specific to an Indigenous community, there was a lot of Indigenous organizations partnering with us. We very much, raise our hands and acknowledge the long, all the forebears of this work who have, who we've learned from and who we've benefited from. For ourselves as individuals, I can go first and acknowledge that I'm here out in the Niagara region of Ontario on the ancestral territories of the Chonanton, Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Chippewa, and Haudenosaunee peoples, under the terms of the Upper Canada treaties, the colonial treaties, as well as Indigenous treaties that predate those ones, the Dish with One Spoon, and the One Wampum Agreement. And myself, I am a lecturer, a faculty member in community psychology at Brock University here in St. Catharines, Ontario, a very recent newcomer to this territory, still trying to learn more about it and the history and my responsibilities as a white settler in these lands. So really grateful to be here, and I'll share more about Research 101 later. Nicholas, would you like to introduce yourself and then take it away with your slides?
Thank you, Scott. My name is Nicholas Cryer. I'm a Indigenous Cree person from Saddle Lake. I was raised up in Calgary, and I am now an uninvited but welcome guest of the unceded ancestral territories of the Coast Salish tribes here in the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations of the local 3 tribes in the city that we call Vancouver, British Columbia. And I thank them with great humility, and I thank them for taking the time in very important lives to speak with us today. And I have one primary responsibility of those tribes, and that's the acknowledgement of many great sacrifices and profound contributions for and to life as we know it in this beautiful part of the world that they've allowed me to live here. So are we going to go with the slides? Okay, yeah, here we go. So I thought I'd begin today by giving you an idea of what we're dealing with in terms of scope and potential for research of Indigenous people in Canada. As you can see, there's a massive variety of ethnographic and cultural realities, experiences, as well as histories, languages, and ways of knowing, expressing, and understanding, and at least as many ways of transmitting this understanding to others in any given research context. This is another map to put the sheer volume in your mind of the diversity among BC's Indigenous people in particular. And it is in this engagement of diversity and the accurate acknowledgement of individual cultural significance under which the most effective and inspiring research will be conducted, and which is basically at the heart of research, as it were, in respect for persons. So what is Indigenous research? Obviously, Indigenous research interests must not only include Indigenous participation, consultation, review, and dissemination. It must also do so with a mind of collaboration and unity by both the academic institutional communities, commercial interests, and the Indigenous community members themselves who are involved in that research, and must do so within the context of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action, all 94 of them, including training and support for trauma-informed practices and ongoing informed consent. So, whereas we are at an advantage in this stage of the seemingly dramatic shifting of the tides for urban Indigenous people, meaning we now not only have a bright and educated generation of young minds full of potential and capability, we also now have the humbled and supportive and discombobulated and possibly a little ashamed and outraged ear of much of Canada's government. And much of the educational institutional systems are now actually beginning to implement dramatic policy changes, and decolonizing practices are being integrated into those large-scale systems, care and infrastructure, which is great. So long as we remember that, remain aware of the fact that this transformation of Canada and its citizenry in our ways of thinking and working to adapt to new concepts, designs, and acknowledgements, unfamiliar territories and their historical contexts. This will, of course, take time to grow into a natural state of being. And as a growing thing, we'll need much nutrition and more importantly, new nurturing in a timely adaptation of new paradigms and visions and collaborations for effective and inspirational results to be witnessed, I guess. Results that our children and their children and our grandchildren, their great-grandchildren can be proud of and thankful for. And that's okay too, because it says that when we humans were at our most crucial time of choice about our world and how it will survive, we chose to sacrifice the selfish nature of humans to only want what is good for themselves, and instead decided after much struggle through years of analyzing and organizing, interpreting research and development interests and efforts, endless discourse and intellectual volleyball, and far too much mistrust and grief, collectively had a decision to commit and strive towards a unified future for all people. That is the notion of Canada, which I believe we can now begin to accept is not so difficult after all. This is a great illustration of the current reality Canada now experiences in everyday life, whether they know it or not, but which researchers will have to carefully consider and most likely prioritize moving forward in order to establish a nationally accepted paradigm of good research based in relationship building and mutual aid and understanding. This is my friend Larissa Healy, a fellow adoptee, and a female grass dancer, actually, which is historically a male-only dance, and super talented graffiti artist who goes by the handle of Girl23. There's some of her art in the background there. And I just use her here to illustrate how amazing our people are, how willing and capable, honoring. They live and share their talents and knowledge and expertise. And that's critical in research. In doing this, in transforming ourselves to repair and renovate our planet and to create a better world for our families and the dreams that they will follow. We will meet with a great many innovations and interesting ideas, and probably some insecurity and ignorance along the way, which is healthy. It basically has to happen in order to evolve us as a community. So we, as Indigenous peoples and organizations and collective voices and visions, should no longer fear that we're being left out or not properly acknowledged, and instead do what my Speakers Bureau partner, Canny DeKelth, calls building our own table, meaning we are free to begin right now, creating space in our realities for others to be welcome to, the purpose of being together, talking openly about the many things we need to learn from one another in order to stay safe and happy, and perhaps have some fun once in a while. Remembering that the fun that we have and the freedoms that we celebrate and honor are forever witnessed over by those who've come before, and that balance, if it's trusted, will remain strong. Sorry, I'm reading off the screen here. That's pretty much, this is the Transformative Health and Justice Research Cluster out of University of British Columbia that I joined about 3 years ago. And they're doing some amazing work across all disciplines of academic research. And we also published an article recently in something called the Turtle Island Journal of Indigenous Health, this is the cover of it in this slide here. It's about 6,000 words, and it's myself and a number of our team talking about the cluster and the work we do, a transdisciplinary research cluster that has peer engagement at the heart of it, and elder-led sort of gatherings and relationship building. This is Elder Roberta Price, our resident elder. She was recently given an honorary PhD doctorate of laws for her 30 years of service to UBC. And then, of course, this is the famous shot of Trudeau and Grand Chief from the Assembly of First Nations on the day that they unveiled the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report. And that was a heavy day. I remember him saying something like he went to some really fancy schools, and when they got to the section on Indigenous peoples, the teacher said, "This isn't very interesting, let's skip it." And he skipped it. So we've come a long way since then, even right since then, the apology, and then to this day. And now that our country is obligated the government anyway, and the church systems to make amends on that. And that, as far as I can see, they're doing it. And this is what Canada is waking up to nowadays. Is this horrible history that they didn't know about, right? That no one was taught about. There's a famous painting of children being taken by the RCMP and whatnot, and that's across the board. If we have interactions across society, including the police, including churches, including the base, but the general citizenry of normal people are completely unawares of this. I still have people asking me, what is a residential school? They don't even know what it is. So that engagement is taken seriously in the fact that we're dealing with people who don't understand quite yet. And we have to be slow and gentle and mature and come to the table with good hearts. And that's where Research 101 came along and just blew my mind. I had no idea the scope of research in this part of the world, downtown East Side, not this part of the world, but the neighborhood I'm from, the marginalized neighborhood I'm from, called the downtown East Side, is inundated with the most research in North America, almost, what Scott's going to talk about more. And the work we've done down there just sort of galvanized the research community around here, as I'm sure it will in most communities once we're start getting organized and they realize how important this is. So there's Scott and Newfound, and the hoodie I designed for him says, "Don't read the book we wrote," which is kind of a phrase of my wife's that she adopted. And Sarah Common of Hives for Humanity, another big-hearted supporter of research in this community, which Scott will talk about more. Then it's led to a number of talks, like as you can see, the one Scott and I are giving today, as well as some SFU radio play and talking that we did at Bandu. But sorry, they're saying I have to put my mask on. COVID restrictions. Anyway, the centerpiece there is my favorite thing of me and Scott. We did an article in a Christian magazine called G's, which is like contemplative counterculture type stuff around Christian faith, and I was really honored to do that with him. If you get a chance, you might want to check that out. Hello? Oh, okay, sorry. And then there's a list of resources which you're able to access at any time after this presentation or ask me about. And those are all to do with sort of Indigenous type research around the country. I'm sure most of you are aware of them. Yeah, and if anybody has any questions for me or anything, just let me know. And I'm grateful to pass it over to my partner, Scott, here for his half. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nick. Really appreciate you sharing. And I mean, this work I'm going to talk about is as much yours as it is mine. So feel free to chime in at any point, or I might ask you about something. But for this part, we're going to jump in a little bit more, talking specifically about the project that Nick already mentioned that we've worked on together in the Downtown East Side neighborhood of Vancouver. And I realized I didn't mention this, but whereas I am now in St. Catharines, Ontario, for the last almost 8 years, I was living in Vancouver, in East Vancouver, and really grateful to have learned so much from Nick and others working in and around the community of the Downtown East Side as a researcher, as a PhD student at SFU at the time. And so in this version of this explanation, we've talked about this work, as Nick said, many times in lots of different spaces. I just want to kind of more quickly get through what was Research 101, the process. I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining what's in the manifesto that I'll talk about, because you can sort of read that on your own time. I think what might be most interesting and useful for this audience, understanding, I think you're all connected to different urban communities around Canada and different organizations. Just trying to share some of what we've learned around doing this process in an urban space, and this sort of central question of how, when you sort of don't have the advantage of an existing recognized governance structure, for example, like a tribal council on a First Nation, or some other form of governance, how can you move towards establishing forms of research governance authority in an urban community where that some of those questions are less clear? So that's sort of how I see kind of the big picture of talking about this work today. Really briefly, as you may know, Vancouver's downtown east side. It's a very small part of Vancouver, just a few city blocks. It's disproportionately researched. It's a very heavily researched neighborhood. This is a kind of an older review now that found there was about 100 peer-reviewed articles that have been published in this 10-year period. A more recent and thorough review by Alina McKay, one of our colleagues from UBC, who's done a lot of work looking at open access and research in the downtown east side, found there was hundreds more that had been published more recently, especially as organizations like the BC Centre on Substance Use and the BC Centre for Excellence in HIV/AIDS have really just started to churn out hundreds of publications every year, a lot of them based on data coming out of this specific neighborhood. A lot of graduate work gets done in this neighborhood, and very little of it is actually accessible to folks that live in the neighborhood. So most of it's behind paywalls still. And so there's lots of different projects people are working on to try and change some of that. But that's sort of the reality. It's a neighborhood covered in research. And of course, research can be helpful. These are some of the things that folks in the Research 101 workshops talked about as some of the benefits that they'd seen of research, which was very much a part of their everyday lives in the downtown east side, creating some opportunities for income, whether as participants in research or as peer research assistants. If it's done in close collaboration with community, it can be a form of education that feels empowering for people, that we're answering questions that we actually had that mattered to us. And it can sometimes actually promote positive social change. In the downtown east side, people are really aware of the role of research in helping to open and sustain innovative harm reduction facilities like Insight and heroin-assisted treatment in the downtown east side. But of course, as I'm sure all of you are very familiar, research can also hurt. We sometimes talk about the triple X of exploitation, extraction, and exhaustion. Exploitation meaning that research often takes more than it gives. Extraction meaning that it can take too much or take what it shouldn't. And exhaustion, that we sometimes don't think about that as much, that research takes a lot out of community members, especially frontline workers or sort of organizational staff who are doing so many other things. We really need the extra burden of having to deal with doofuses like me from the academy. Lots of other ways that research can be a source of harm or discouragement or disappointment for folks, providing a sense of false hope. They promised us this. They said research would solve all our problems or compel people to change this situation, and it just doesn't work that way. It can be a way of delaying action. Instead of doing the things that the community knows are needed, we say we've got to study the problem more. It can be irrelevant. Sometimes research, especially heavy theory-based research, can feel very disconnected from the lived realities of people, that you're struggling every day. Be a source of re-traumatization, especially a lot of research sometimes, just asks people, what was your worst experience? Tell us about that. We want to know everything about that, all of the things that are harmful and painful for you. And it can perpetuate stigma. This is something that's really experienced really well in the downtown east side. This is one example. It's a study that came out of SFU. Hope nobody knows these folks. Maybe you do, don't tell me. But this is a very well-intentioned kind of public health study, and they didn't talk to any participants. They were just purely linking administrative records. They were able to tell, kind of develop this story looking at service use in the downtown east side. And they, kind of tried to calculate some of the costs associated with high-risk individuals that are using a lot of different services. Very well-intentioned. They're trying to talk about some of the inadequacies in the system, the revolving door between the justice and health and social services. Of course, the media picks it up, spins it a slightly different way, and says SFU study suggests 300 offenders on the downtown east side cost $26.5 million in services, which of course then gets picked up by colonists, more reactionary folks who have a vendetta to, kind of put every argument they can forward to remove and dismantle communities of marginalized people, like in the downtown east side. So this is sort of one example. And of course, we've seen this in lots of other communities that are heavily researched when there's all of that focus on what's wrong, what's broken, what's damaged. As folks may be familiar, the amazing critical researcher Eve Tuck, who's now at the OISC, can't remember the acronym, but she's in Ontario now. Anyways, and she talks about damage research and says, you know, the time has come for our communities, urban communities, Indigenous communities, to refuse to be complicit in our further categorization as only damaged, as only broken. And that's difficult, and research plays such a huge role in that. And part of our goal has been to try and what are ways we can intervene in that process. It's similar for media. It's not only research. I mean, these things, as Chantal pointed out, research can sometimes be a very broad category, and that's certainly how people experience it. This is from one of our collaborators and close friends, Jewel Chapman. She's also a co-author on the manifesto. This was a CBC article just from 2 years ago that she was asked to interview for. And the narrative that came out of this interview was that the downtown east side is getting worse and worse. It's falling apart. And she read what had been written from her comments. She said, wow, that was like, you know, one part of what I shared, but they cut out all of the positive things, all of the things I said were good about this neighborhood that I, you know, value about living here. And they just made it this damage story of everything is a disaster and falling apart. You know, so that kind of thing is sort of what we've tried to intervene with. So this all kind of leads to this wider question that research can cause harm and often does, especially in urban spaces. Are there forms of harm reduction for research? One more clear-cut response would be, let's just stop all the research, which feels unlikely to happen in the downtown east side when there's so much funding and careers and infrastructure built around doing research, continuing to do research in this space. So we've sort of asked a more harm reduction-y question: how can we reduce harms? And these are some of our goals with Research 101, to try and create a process for clarifying community expectations around what is respectful, useful, ethical research in this neighborhood, and try and reduce some of the harms associated with research by empowering communities and organizations to say no to researchers. That was something people shared. I think actually Nick shared in one of our very early meetings. It would be helpful if we knew others were saying no, we knew when others were saying no, or to simply demand more from researchers, in part by communicating those expectations. This is a partnership between a few key groups. Our community partner, as Nick mentioned, was an organization called Hives for Humanity, who mostly does gardening and beekeeping in the downtown east side. But they're also really interested in sort of shifting the narrative about the downtown east side, which is how they got involved in this work. SFU was a great partner. This is Johal, who gave us, you know, a lot of our kind of startup funding to host Research 101 and brokered a lot of the connections. Also SFPIRG, a group up at SFU. And then in terms of collaborators, who participated, who was at the table, there was a lot of different organizations. These are most of them. And so these are some of the kind of inclusion criteria here, I guess, where we were trying to connect with organizations that we knew were getting a lot of requests from researchers, that were often partnering with researchers, that had different histories with research in the downtown east side. And we also were keen to partner a bit more with sort of grassroots types of organizations that were, you know, user-led. So the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users, for example, has a governance board that's completely made up of members. They're not staff people. They're people, you know, that represent the wider audience or clientele of the organization. A few Indigenous organizations here. The Western Aboriginal Harm Reduction Society is a really important player on the downtown east side. Culture Saves Lives is a part of the what's the thing called? Portland Hotel Society. You know, and some of these other organizations, Native Health Society. You know, certainly a lot of interaction amongst the urban Indigenous community in the downtown east side, and these were some of the key organizations we were working with. So we tried to engage with sort of a wide array. It's by no means representative of the entire community. That's one of the questions we'll probably come back to. We were trying to mostly have, you know, people with lived experience, peers that were not, you know, academic researchers, that were not, you know, executive directors. These were sort of more, you know, grassroots folks who experienced research as peer research assistants and as participants and as intermediaries with organizations. really quickly, we ended up designing together this series of workshops that I helped to facilitate. We called it Research 101 because it was all about kind of just the nuts and bolts of how does research happen in this community. And we shared, people's experiences with research and different stages of research, from getting to know each other to, how do you think about ethical review in research and community settings? How do you negotiate power imbalances in doing community-based research where community members are often involved, but to what extent? And how do you deal with the end stages of research, of feeding back what was learned, of sharing knowledge, of bringing reciprocity to the process? This is our final week, where this is some of the folks that participated. There's Nick, there's me. And what we decided is we had some folks that helped me based on notes we'd be taking on the workshops. I kind of drafted a very early rough draft of this manifesto. That was Nick's idea, to call it the Manifesto for Ethical Research in the Antony side. And we sat together around these tables for the final week and went over every line and word in the draft, and agreed that this was a co-authored document, that everyone who participated in these workshops would have their name on the list as a co-author. We would just put those alphabetically, kind of bucking the academic who did the most, whose idea was this trend. So this is there's two versions of it. You could find this one. I'd recommend this one just because it has a lot more resources. There's hyperlinks to different examples and papers that you can read here. There's also a list of individuals and organizations that have endorsed the manifesto, but there's a much nicer looking version that some very kind folks at SFU made for us, that has a lot of cool images and graphic design, and we were able to print a lot of copies of those, which was great in the community to be able to hand this out to folks, and folks really liked having something they could hold tangibly. It wasn't just a random Google Doc. This is a related project that more came out of Hives for Humanity. This is a little fold up card that we made, and it just includes a whole bunch of critical questions that somebody could ask when they are being invited to share their story with someone, with an outsider, with a journalist or a researcher, around how can I, make sure that I know everything I need to know to be able to protect myself and my community, to think through how am I going to ensure that I'm respected, that my story is respected, that I'm paid for my time, that this isn't taken away from me. So you can check that out online as well. Very quickly, the manifesto kind of talks about different stages of the research process, some of the things that folks felt would be really important to know about researchers when they're starting out a new research project together. We talked a lot about ethical review. We'll come back to this, but there's a lot of limitations of a university research ethics board and this sort of TCPS2, the National Ethics Guidance in Canada, doesn't always consider community representation or some of the risks at a more collective level beyond the individual and that sort of medical model. We talked about different versions of thinking about community ethics review, and we'll talk more about those in a sec. We talked about just sort of the nuts and bolts of collaboration from academics who often maybe don't appropriately acknowledge their privilege or the real imbalances in power and access when they're trying to do collaborative work with people that don't have that same access to power. People had lots of experiences with fancy researchers not treating them with a lot of respect, or sort of looking down on them as just peers or just community members, or signaling their mistrust or the stigma towards people who use drugs, even as they were partnering with them on research. A really important piece of that people in Research 101 often shared what was the importance of being trauma informed in research, thinking ahead in terms of how do we not make our research a terrible, triggering, traumatic experience for people that have maybe experienced a lot of negative things in their life. If we're going to do that, how do we do that in the safest way possible? How do we plan in advance to support people? These kinds of questions. And then finally, in sort of these later stages of research, people shared stories of researchers never returning. And we brainstormed ways of, how could we ensure that doesn't happen anymore? How could we plan in advance and make, commitments to return and share meaningfully and equitably with the community, a requirement of initiating work together. How can we make it so that people are planning for that in their grants rather than saying to the community at some late stage, you know what, I'm here with my PowerPoint, where's the people to hear me talk about the research, like I did my thing. No, that work should fall to researchers. Also recognizing that knowledge translation is not the same as reciprocity. And even if you do come back and share your findings as a researcher, you still got way more out of this in the community most of the time. People had lots of ideas about what else you could do to partner with them, to become their ally, to work in solidarity towards action on the basis of the knowledge that you produced together. This is sort of the final section that I think may be the most relevant or interesting for folks, sort of in terms of like, what have we done next? So making this manifesto was an amazing experience. That was sort of step one. We never in our wildest dreams thought it would go as far as it has, that people around the world have found it and said this is really cool and shared it. And but in the community of the Downtown East Side, in this urban space, we've tried to be thinking in the last couple of years more strategically around what can this actually do in terms of intervening in these negative ongoing dynamics of exploitation and harm through research. So one thing about having a manifesto or some kind of community ethics expression is that it's kind of nice. You can point to something and say, hey, here's a thing that exists. A bunch of people from the community, maybe not everyone, said, here's some of our experiences. Here's what didn't go so well. Here's what we expect instead. But what do you do then? Because the researcher who's the most likely to find that manifesto and think it's interesting and want to follow it is kind of the least likely person who was going to do really shisty, exploitative stuff in the community anyways. So it's kind of it's an opt-in system. It doesn't actually solve your problem. And so ways that we've tried to move towards a wider kind of structural intervention are the following. So first of all, trying to build support for that manifesto, recognizing we didn't have the most possible representative group around the table when we did it, but we've since gone around to a whole bunch more organizations and individuals in the community at research institutions and said, this is the work we've done. What do you think? In fact, do you feel confident supporting this, putting an official name behind it to say, we endorse this work that's happened and this expression of expectations in the community? So in a community setting, that the goal there is really empowerment and education. This exists. Feel free to hand this to researchers when they come a knocking and they say, hey, where's some participants for us to research? And you can say, we don't really know you, maybe, but check this out, give it a read and tell us how you plan to respond to this manifesto. That's one way that people use the manifesto in the Downtown East Side. On the institutional side, at universities, at ethics boards, we try and share about the manifesto as a form of increasing education, but also accountability. Hopefully, as people have sometimes invited us to speak in their research methods classes, people gain a greater understanding of what would be required of them if they wanted to do research in this community. At research ethics boards, that's sort of been a whole other piece of the conversation. We've had this great partnership with the UBC Learning Exchange, which is located in the Downtown East Side, and they liaise with a lot of researchers that work in the Downtown East Side. But they connected us to research ethics boards, UBC, SFU, Providence Healthcare, who do a lot of work in the Downtown East Side, who review a lot of work. And they're not usually super qualified to be able to say, here are all of the things you need to be thinking about to work in this context. So the research ethics boards were really excited about us doing this manifesto thing, because they said, yes, this is the piece that's always missing for us. We can't do this. We don't know this stuff, but the community knows. How can we build that connection? So potentially even, the folks at the REB can say, you want to do this thing? Have you read the manifesto? Have you talked to these people? Maybe you should do that before you come to the REB. Another version or way that we've been thinking about this project is what we call the Community Research Ethics Workshop, which is still something that's in development. It doesn't exist as a thing you could access now. We hope it will continue to grow and expand and become more concrete. If we can find some more funding, if you've got ideas, let us know. This is something that we spent a lot of time thinking about over the last couple of years to find ways of getting the lived experience and expertise of folks like Nick and Jewel and Jim and Simona and others who live in this community to be able to review from their expertise the ethics, the respect of research proposals. We've done a number of practice reviews of ethics proposals. We've tried to build a model of what that could look like. So that's something that is sort of ongoing. Another smaller piece, this kind of relates to just how do you change the wider system in which community-based research happens, where there's a lot of engagement with the community, but to what extent. It's called the Community Engaged Research Ethics Training. It's a more accessible version of the online TCPS2 core tutorial. If you know what that is, it's this old clunky Flash-based introduction to research ethics policy in Canada that a lot of universities require for people on an ethics application. They often make an exception and say, if you're a community member, you don't actually have to do it, which is kind of goes along with this assumption. If you're a community member, you're not really a part of this research project. You're kind of a consultant, or you're kind of on the edges of it. This is a group of researchers that said, no, if community members are part of a research project truly collaboratively, they need to be learning about ethics. They need to be on that ethics application. But they asked people to go to that online thing, and people are like, yeah, I don't know how to do this. I don't know, there's a lot of assumptions here that I know how to, I've got access to Wi-Fi. So we made a more accessible version that uses community-based workshops, that integrates the manifesto, that's really relevant to folks in the Downtown East Side. We're just working on making this open access with a facilitator's guide and writing an article about what we did there. Hope to have that available soon. The final point that I'll leave us with is this question of the process. The initial step for us was Research 101, the series of workshops, these structured conversations we had in the community with people most affected by the harms of research in the Downtown East Side. And we really think that's a process you could easily replicate elsewhere. And so we wrote this article together in Harm Reduction Journal. You can check it out later. We'll send along some resources. But it just really outlines what did we do, but also how could you do this somewhere else? Because there are lots of heavily researched communities. A lot of Indigenous communities are heavily researched. A lot of urban Indigenous communities are heavily researched. Very broadly, to kind of put it at a more general level, we tried to get organized. We formed those partnerships. We figured out who needs to be in these conversations. We came together, we had the workshops, we told stories, we shared, how do you address this problem when researchers come? Do you have like a thing you do internally? How can we make this more of a collective response to a collective issue? We tried to share as much of what people were already doing and also come up with new ideas of what we could do when we're facing it as a community. I think it was important that we wrote it down, that we'd summarized those conversations in this manifesto format that was shareable, that was clearly a product of the community, that represented folks. And then we shared that as widely as we could. We've done a lot of work to translate that knowledge to make sure people know about it, and it doesn't just sit on some shelf somewhere. Just to wrap up, a few examples of what other urban communities have done around these issues of research governance. The one that was the most inspirational for us is called the Bronx Community Research Review Board in New York. This is a mostly racialized low-income community in the Bronx that long history of exploitative, extractive, harmful medical research. And this is a really cool project that's it is a full-fledged research ethics board made up of community members, and they have some staff, and they do these trainings around research methods and research ethics review. So that's a really cool model you can check out. This was very heartening for us, some folks that were inspired by our work in Vancouver, a bunch of kind of activists in the inner city in Edmonton, a lot of Indigenous groups there. Did their own process very much like what we suggested, and they called it Research 102, which was kind of very nice for us. You can read that manifesto online as well at this site. This is one we just recently found out about. I don't think they were inspired by us because their work predated us, but it's a really, really cool example in the Jane Finch neighborhood of Toronto. What do they call it? The Jane Finch Community Research Partnership. They've got their own set of kind of guidelines. They've got training modules for researchers. They're doing a lot of amazing work. They're kind of still just ramping up. Highly recommend you check them out as well. It's just another example of how are people responding to this. And in the discussion part, which will come next, we're not going to have a ton of time for question and answer right now, but we can hopefully talk a little bit more about some of your experiences and some of your ideas of what from all that maybe resonates with your context, or could be the start of an idea of how could we address maybe similar issues. Maybe you've already been doing stuff like that. We'd love to hear about it, but I hope that can be sort of the next stage of this discussion. Thank you very much. And I think we're pretty much just going to have a break for the translator right now. Is that right, Chantal?
Yeah, thank you both so much. This was really inspiring to me, and I'm really excited to read Research 102. So yeah, I think maybe that we just have 4 minutes before the top of the hour. It makes the most sense to give the translators a break now, if that makes sense to everybody else. And then we'll come back after the 5-ish minutes. We live in a timely world rather than a timed world. So once folks are back and feeling settled, we can get started again, but at least a 5-minute break. And then we can do a much bigger discussion together if you have. And I think that that's also good because it gives folks a chance to formulate questions for Scott and Nicholas. So yeah, why don't we do that?